April 23, 1945, just after dawn. Somewhere along a shattered country road outside Regensburg, Germany, the air still smelled of smoke. Not the sharp burst of artillery, this was older smoke, heavy and damp, clinging to the ruins of farmhouses and the broken wheels of abandoned carts. A low fog pressed against the ground, turning every movement into a ghostly blur. In the distance, an American convoy idled, engines rumbling like restrained thunder. Beside the road, a group of German women stood in silence. They were fragments of uniforms, field gray skirts, worn boots, Red Cross armbands stained by weeks of retreat. Some had been signal auxiliaries, others nurses. A few barely more than girls, pulled from training schools in the final desperate months of the Reich. Their hands were raised, not high in defiance, but stiff with exhaustion. Unteroffizier Marta Klein tried to keep her shoulders straight. She was 26, a communications clerk from Munich who had not slept properly in 5 days. Dirt streaked her cheek where tears had dried unnoticed. She had heard the stories everyone had: Russian camps in the east, columns that vanished, revenge for cities burned and families buried beneath rubble. Now the Americans were here. A U.S. Army Jeep rolled closer, tires crunching slowly over gravel. The white star on its hood was half hidden beneath mud. Two soldiers stepped out, one tall and narrow-faced, the other broad-shouldered with a medic satchel bouncing against his hip. Rifles hung ready, but not aimed. The women noticed that immediately. No shouting, no blows, no chaos, just measured footsteps approaching through the fog. Marta felt her pulse hammer in her throat. This is the moment, she thought. The moment everything she feared would begin. Her fingers trembled, though she forced them still. Around her, another woman whispered a prayer under her breath. Someone else quietly sobbed. The tall American Staff Sergeant Daniel Harper, 90th Infantry Division, stopped a few paces away. His German was clumsy, learned from phrase cards and hurried briefings. Der Krieg ist vorbei für Sie, he said carefully. The war is over for you. The words hung in the cold air. No one moved. Because endings, they had learned, could be crueler than battle. Harper studied their faces: mud, fatigue, terror barely contained. He had seen that same expression on liberated civilians in France, on displaced families wandering bombed roads. Fear had a universal language. He lowered his rifle, not slung over the shoulder in triumph, lowered deliberately until the barrel pointed toward the ground. It was a small gesture, but every woman saw it. Behind him, the medic Corporal Luis Ortega was already scanning the group with a different kind of urgency. Not for threats, for wounds. His eyes paused on a young nurse clutching her arm too tightly, fabric dark with dried blood. He stepped forward without waiting for permission. The nurse flinched as he approached, bracing for rough hands. Instead, Ortega spoke softly, voice almost apologetic. "Easy, medic." He tapped the red cross on his helmet. She didn't understand the English, but she understood the tone. Slowly and certainly she loosened her grip. When Ortega began unwrapping the dirty bandage, several of the women stared in disbelief. This was not how surrender was supposed to feel. Not after years of propaganda, of whispered warnings about enemy brutality. Marta felt confusion rising through her fear, disorienting as dizziness. Why aren't they shouting? Why aren't they angry? An American truck rumbled closer, canvas flaps snapping in the wind. More soldiers climbed down, forming a loose perimeter. Still disciplined, still calm, one of them offered a canteen toward the prisoners. No one took it. The silence stretched painfully long. Then, the youngest among them, a 17-year-old auxiliary named Lise, stepped forward with trembling hands. She accepted the canteen as if it might explode. For a heartbeat she simply stared at it, unable to believe it was real, water, clean, freely given. Her composure shattered, tears spilled down her face before she could stop them. She drank in desperate gulps, shoulders shaking, the sound of quiet sobbing cutting through the morning fog. The other women watched, and something inside them began to crack. Not relief, not yet, Just the first fracture in certainty. Sergeant Harper exchanged a glance with Ortega. Neither spoke. There was nothing to say. War had taught them that moments like this were fragile, easily broken by the wrong word, the wrong movement, so they kept their voices low, their gestures slow, their weapons lowered. In the distance, church bells rang faintly through the ruined countryside. No one knew who was ringing them, maybe a priest who had survived the bombing, maybe a villager signaling that the fighting had finally passed. The sound drifted over the road like something from another lifetime. Marta realized, with a strange hollow sensation, that she was still alive, and not being hurt. The certainty she had carried for months that capture meant suffering, humiliation, revenge began to slip away. In its place came something far more unsettling, uncertainty, because if the enemy was not a monster, then what did that make everything she had believed? An American officer approached now, boots polished despite the mud. Captain Robert Ellison. He surveyed the scene quickly, professionally, then nodded once to Harper. "Get them transported," he said quietly. "Division wants all auxiliaries processed at the temporary camp west of the river." Harper acknowledged the order. Routine, efficient, almost gentle. The women were guided, never shoved toward the waiting truck. As Marta climbed the wooden step, she braced herself again. Kindness can be a trick. She warned herself. The cruelty comes later. Everyone knew that. Everyone had said so. She sat on the hard bench, hands clenched in her lap, heart pounding as the canvas flap dropped closed. Darkness settled inside the truck. The engine roared to life. The convoy began to move. No one spoke, only the sound of quiet breathing, and somewhere in the shadows, a woman crying softly, not from pain, but from something she did not yet understand. The truck rolled west toward the American lines, toward a place none of them could imagine, toward an encounter that would challenge everything they believed about the enemy and about themselves. And before the sun set that day, several of those women would experience a moment so unexpected. It would follow them for the rest of their lives. The convoy crossed the Danube just before noon. Steel tires rattled against the temporary military bridge, each metallic clank echoing over slow gray water below. Marta Klein sat rigid inside the truck, counting the sounds without meaning to. 1, 2, 3, anything to keep her thoughts from spiraling. Around her, the other women swayed with the movement, shoulders brushing in silence. No guards shouted. No rifles jabbed their backs. Only the steady grind of an engine carrying them deeper into the unknown. When the truck finally slowed, sunlight pierced through a gap in the canvas. Dust floated in the beam like drifting snow. Someone near the rear inhaled sharply. They had arrived. The flap opened. For a moment, no one moved. The women blinked against the brightness, bracing themselves for barbed wire, barking dogs, the familiar architecture of fear. Marta felt her stomach tighten, muscles preparing for humiliation before it even came. But what she saw did not match the stories? Yes, there was wire war required boundaries. Yes, there were guards, discipline demanded order. But beyond the fence stood rows of clean white tents, aligned with careful precision. Wooden walkways kept boots out of the mud. A field kitchen sent thin ribbons of steam into the cool spring air, carrying a smell so unfamiliar it took Marta a second to recognize it. Soup. Real soup. With vegetables. The scent alone made several prisoners dizzy. Corporal Ortega jumped down first, then turned and offered a hand to the nearest woman as if she were stepping from a train rather than into captivity. She hesitated, staring at his open palm, suspicion fighting with exhaustion. Slowly, she accepted, leather glove against trembling fingers. Nothing happened, no trick, no cruelty waiting behind the gesture. One by one, the women climbed down. A U.S. military policeman noted their numbers on a clipboard. His pencil moved calmly, methodically processing, not punishing. Nearby, a nurse in American uniform prepared a folding table stacked with bandages and enamel basins of clean water. Clean water. Marta felt something twist painfully in her chest. For weeks, cleanliness had been a memory. Retreat meant mud, blood, and the sour smell of fear that never washed away. Yet here, inside enemy lines, stood bowls of clear water reflecting the sky. Medical first, Captain Ellison ordered quietly. No shouting, just procedure. The wounded nurse from the roadside was guided forward. She winced, expecting roughness. Instead, the American nurse Lieutenant Helen Morris met her eyes with a look Marta could not interpret at first. It wasn't pity, it wasn't superiority, it was concern. Morris spoke gently, voice steady as she cleaned the wound. The German woman trembled, breath hitching as dried blood softened under warm water. Pain came. Yes, but careful pain, purposeful pain, the kind meant to heal. A tear slipped down the prisoner's temple into her hair. She whispered something in German to quiet to hear. Morris didn't understand the words, but she understood tears. She placed a folded cloth in the woman's hand and gave the smallest reassuring nod. Around them, the other prisoners watched in stunned silence. Propaganda had painted Americans as ruthless bombers, destroyers of cities, enemies without mercy. Yet the scene before them felt almost ordinary, like a hospital, like peace trying to remember itself. Marta's turn came. She stepped forward on unsteady legs, aware of every heartbeat. Lieutenant Morris checked her wrists, her face, the dark circles beneath her eyes. "You're exhausted," Morris murmured softly, more to herself than anyone else. Marta caught only the tone, but tone was enough. She realized, with sudden disorientation, that no one had looked at her this way in months. Not as a soldier, not as an enemy, simply as a human being who was tired. The realization frightened her more than cruelty would have. Because cruelty was predictable, kindness was not. Processing continued through the afternoon. Names recorded. Units identified. Personal items tagged and stored, not stolen. Each small fairness felt unreal, like walking through a dream where the rules of war had quietly changed. Then came the moment none of them expected. Food distribution. Large metal pots were carried from the field kitchen, lids clattering softly. Steam rolled upward, rich with the scent of potatoes, carrots, and something else, meat, perhaps. Real meat, not the thin substitutes of the final war months. Tin bowls were placed into waiting hands. Some women stared at them, frozen. Marta felt heat rising through the metal into her palms. The warmth traveled up her arms, into her chest, until her throat tightened painfully. She had imagined starvation and captivity, punishment, cold revenge served slowly. Instead, soup. She lifted the spoon, her hand shook so badly the liquid rippled. "Don't cry," she told herself. Not here, not in front of them. Across the table, young Lise had already taken a bite. The taste hit her like memory home kitchens, childhood winners, a world untouched by sirens. Her face crumpled instantly. A sob escaped before she could stop it. Not loud, not dramatic. Just the quiet breaking of someone who had prepared for suffering and found mercy instead. The sound spread through the group like a fracture in glass. Another woman covered her mouth, another bowed her head. Someone began to weep openly, shoulders shaking over a bowl of American soup. The guards did nothing. No ridicule, no commands to be silent. They simply stood watch, eyes carefully turned away to grant privacy in the middle of a prison camp. Marta felt tears blur her vision despite every effort to remain composed. They slid down her cheeks, falling unnoticed into the steam rising from her food. She realized she was not crying from hunger. She was crying because the world no longer made sense. Everything she had been told about the enemy, about revenge, about cruelly waiting in capture was dissolving with every gentle gesture, every quiet kindness. And if those stories were wrong, what else had been? As evening shadows lengthened across the camp, a distant church bell rang again from somewhere beyond the river. The sound carried softly through the cooling air, mingling with the low murmur of soldiers and the fragile silence of women confronting an impossible truth. For the first time since surrender, fear was no longer the strongest emotion inside Marta Klein. Something else was growing in its place, something far more dangerous to the walls built by years of war. Hope. And before the night was over, One simple act inside a dimly lit tent would push several of these women past tears into a moment none of them would ever forget. Darkness settled slowly over the camp west of the Danube. Not the violent darkness of blackout sirens or burning cities, just evening, ordinary and calm. A thin crescent moon rose above the wire, pale light brushing the tops of white canvas tents. Somewhere near the perimeter, an American sentry shifted his weight, boots crunching softly on gravel. The sound was small, human, almost peaceful. Inside Tent 12, the air smelled faintly of soap, real soap. Marta Klein sat on the lower bunk, hands resting on rough gray blankets that were astonishingly clean. She kept touching the fabric as if it might vanish. Across from her, Lise had already curled onto her side, exhaustion pulling her towards sleep despite everything. A lantern swayed gently from a wooden pole, casting warm, unsteady light across tired faces. No one spoke for a long time, because silence, after months of chaos, felt unfamiliar. Outside, distant voices murmured in English low, relaxed, unhurried. Not the sharp barks of command the women expected from guards, just conversation. Someone even laughed quietly, the sound drifting through canvas like a memory from another life. Marta felt tension she hadn't known she carried begin to loosen slowly, painfully like frozen fingers thawing. And that frightened her, because relaxation meant vulnerability. Vulnerability meant danger. At least, it always had before. A shadow moved at the tent entrance. Every woman stiffened instantly, breath caught, muscles locked. The old fear surged back with brutal speed. This is it. This is when it changes. The canvas flap opened. Lieutenant Helen Morris stepped inside, ducking slightly beneath the frame. The lantern light revealed her face tired, lined with the same long war as everyone else. But her eyes remained steady, searching the tent not for threats, only for need. She carried a small wooden crate. For a moment, no one understood why she was there. Then she set the crate down and opened it. Inside were folded cloths, extra bandages, small wrapped bars of soap, and something so ordinary it felt unreal. Chocolate, a few simple ration squares, slightly melted at the edges. The sight struck the room like lightning. No one moved, no one even breathed loudly. Because chocolate belonged to a world before collapse, before rubble, before hunger, before surrender. Seeing it here, inside an enemy prison camp, felt almost impossible. Morris spoke softly, choosing words she knew might not be understood, but hoping tone would carry meaning. "For you," she said gently. She pushed the crate forward. The women stared as if it might disappear. Marta's mind searched desperately for logic. Why give this to prisoners? Why waste it on the enemy? Nothing aligned with the rules she had learned. War was supposed to harden people, not soften them. Yet here stood proof of the opposite. Slowly, hesitantly, Lise sat up, her eyes fixed on the chocolate like a starving child staring through bakery glass. She looked toward Marta, silently asking permission as if kindness might still be a trap. Marta didn't know what to believe anymore, but she gave the smallest nod. Lise reached forward, fingers trembling so badly she almost dropped the piece when Morris placed it in her palm. For a long second she only held it, feeling its weight, its warmth, its reality. Then she tasted it. The reaction was immediate. Her face crumpled not with fear, not with pain, but with overwhelming memory. Tears spilled down both cheeks as she tried to swallow, breath breaking into quiet, helpless sobs. Chocolate, sweetness, childhood, gone for so long, returned in the last place she expected. The sound broke something open inside the tent. Another woman covered her eyes. Someone else began to cry silently into her blanket. Even Marta felt her throat tighten until breathing hurt. Lieutenant Morris did nothing dramatic. No speeches, no grand gestures. She simply stayed, present, quiet, human. After a moment, she began handing out the remaining pieces, one to each woman, equal and fair. Not charity, not superiority, just sharing what little comfort war allowed. When she reached Marta, their eyes met. For the first time, Marta truly looked at her not as an enemy officer, not as a symbol of the opposing side, but as another exhausted woman standing in the same long shadow of war. To strangers, to uniforms, one shared fatigue. Marta accepted the chocolate with shaking fingers. "Wareham," she whispered before she could stop herself. Why? Morris didn't understand the word, but she understood the question. Her answer came not in German, but in something simpler, a soft expression, a tired, knowing look, and one quiet sentence, "Because the war's almost over." The meaning reached Marta anyway. And in that instant, something shifted deep inside her, more powerful than fear, more disorienting than capture. The image of the enemy she had carried for years began to collapse, not suddenly, but irreversibly. Across the tent, the crying slowly faded into fragile calm. Women lay back against clean pillows, clutching small squares of chocolate like proof that the world might still contain mercy. Outside, the sentry continued his slow walk beneath the moon. Somewhere in the distance, artillery rumbled faintly, reminding everyone the war had not ended yet. But inside Tent 12, for a few quiet minutes, it felt as if it had. Marta closed her eyes, exhaustion finally pulling her downward. Yet one thought echoed through her fading consciousness, persistent and impossible to ignore. If the enemy can show kindness, what does that mean for everything we believed? Before dawn, news would arrive in the camp, news from the wider front, that would force these women to confront an even deeper truth about the war, and about themselves, a truth far more difficult than surrender. Dawn came quietly to the camp west of the Danube. No sirens, no artillery. Just pale blue light spreading across rows of white tents, turning the night shadows into soft gray shapes. A thin layer of frost clung to the wooden walkways, crunching faintly beneath the boots of the morning watch. Inside Tent 12, Marta Klein woke to a sound she did not recognize at first. Bird song. For a few disoriented seconds, she thought she was home in Munich spring mornings before the bombing, before ration lines, before uniforms replaced ordinary clothes. Then memory returned all at once, heavy and inescapable. She was a prisoner. The war was still happening. Nothing was normal, and yet, something felt different. Around her, the other women stirred slowly beneath clean blankets. No one had shouted them awake. No whistles, no threats. Just natural light pulling them back into consciousness like any other morning in any other year. Lee still clutched the empty chocolate wrapper in her hand, fingers curled protectively even in sleep. Marta noticed it and felt that same tightness in her chest again, the unfamiliar ache of gratitude mixed with confusion. Outside, voices carried through the cool air, but today the tone had changed. There was movement, quicker, lighter, threaded with something almost impossible to name: energy, anticipation. Marta stepped out of the tent and into the cold morning. American soldiers clustered near the command post, speaking in rapid bursts. One held a folded sheet of paper, edges trembling slightly in the breeze. Another ran a hand across his face as if trying to wake from a dream. Then she saw Captain Ellison. He stood very still, reading the message again and again, as though repetition might confirm it was real. Sergeant Harper approached. "Sir," he asked quietly. Ellison looked up, eyes distant with disbelief. "It's over," he said, the simple words, barely louder than breath. Harper didn't move. "Over, sir." Ellison gave a slow nod. "Germany has surrendered. Unconditional. Effective this morning." The sentence seemed to hang in the air, without weight, too large to settle, too sudden to understand. Around them, soldiers exchanged uncertain glances. Someone let out a short laugh that sounded closer to a sob. Months of fighting, years of dying, and now, silence. Within minutes, the news rippled outward through the camp like a shockwave without sound. Guards whispered to medics. Clerks repeated the words carefully, as if afraid they might break. Inside the prisoner tents, confusion stirred. Marta saw Lieutenant Morris approaching across the frost-covered ground, her pace quick but controlled. Something in her expression, relief mixed with exhaustion, made Marta's pulse quicken. The flap opened. The women looked up, For a moment, Morris couldn't speak. The weight of the war's end sat visibly on her shoulders, pressing down years of strain all at once. When she finally found her voice, it came out soft, almost fragile. "The war is finished," she said slowly. No translation followed. None was needed. The meaning passed through the room in an instant. Finished, the word felt unreal, like something imagined during sleepless nights, never meant to arrive in daylight. Several women simply stared, unable to react. Others shook their heads faintly, disbelief stronger than hope. Lise was the first to understand. Her breath caught sharply. "Vorbei," she whispered. "Over." Morris gave the smallest nod. That was enough. Lisa's face collapsed into tears deeper than the night before, deeper than hunger or fear. These tears carried years inside them. Bombings, loss, marching columns, the slow death of certainty. She covered her mouth, sobbing into her hands as relief and grief collided without mercy. One by one, the others followed. Some cried quietly, some openly. One woman sank to her knees beside the bunk, shoulders shaking with silent prayers. Marta did not cry, not at first. She stood perfectly still, the words echoing through her mind without landing. The war is finished. She tried to picture a world beyond uniforms, beyond orders, beyond enemies. Her thoughts found only emptiness. Because if the war defined everything, what remained when it was gone? Her knees weakened suddenly, forcing her to sit. Breath came shallow, uneven. And then, without warning, the tears arrived. Not violent, not loud. Just steady, unstoppable streams sliding down a face that had held composure for far too long. She wasn't crying only for relief. She was crying for the years that would never return, for the people who would never see peace, and for the unbearable realization that kindness from the enemy had been real all along. Across the tent, Lieutenant Morris watched in silence, eyes glistening despite herself. Victory did not feel like celebration here. It felt like standing in the ruins after a storm, counting who remained. Outside, a distant cheer rose from American troops near the motor pool, brief, restrained, almost uncertain. No wild celebration, just tired men acknowledging survival. The sound drifted into the tent like an echo from another world. Marta wiped her cheeks slowly. Her gaze moved to Morris, searching for something she could not name. Questions without language, emotions without borders. For the first time since capture, she did something unthinkable. She spoke softly in broken English. "War finished," she said, voice trembling. Morris nodded. Marta hesitated, then forced out the next words with visible effort. "Thank you." 2 words, simple, revolutionary. The distance between enemy lines built over years of hatred narrowed in that fragile moment to the space between 2 women standing in the same quiet tent. Morris swallowed hard, emotion tightening her throat. She answered just as softly, "You're safe now." Safe, a word that once felt impossible, now spoken aloud. But safety did not mean certainty. Because beyond the wire waited a shattered country, uncertain futures, and questions no surrender document could answer. The end of war was not the end of consequence. And within days, decisions would be made about where these women would go, how they would live, and whether the fragile compassion born inside this camp could survive the long road into peace. For Marta Klein, one final moment still lay ahead. A moment that would define how she remembered the enemy for the rest of her life. By mid-morning, the frost had melted into the damp smell of spring. Sunlight glinted off the wooden walkways, highlighting the clean order of the camp. The chaos of retreat-burned bridges, abandoned towns, shattered vehicles was replaced here by calm efficiency. Every tent, every table, every soldier moved with purpose, yet without urgency. There was time, too much time, perhaps, for the German women to process what was happening. Marta Klein stepped outside Tent 12 with a small tin cup of steaming soup in her hands. The warmth burned her fingers, but the sensation was welcome. For the first time in weeks, she felt more alive than afraid. Around her, Lise and the other auxiliaries clustered near the mess area, each hesitant to move too far, as if the very ground might betray them. Corporal Luis Ortega approached, carrying another crate of supplies. He moved slowly, deliberately, keeping his eyes level with the prisoners, not towering over them, not studying them as property, but simply as humans in need. "Breakfast," he said simply, setting down the crate and gesturing toward the bowls. "Eat. Warm. First. Then. Shower." He paused, glancing at Marta. "Hot water. Soap. Clothes after." The word sounded too ordinary, too civilized, to be trusted. Marta wanted to believe they were a trick. She wanted to prepare for betrayal. But the smell of the soup, the steam rising, the organized efficiency, it all whispered something she had not felt in months: reliability. Tent by tent, the women were guided through the process. The wounded received medical attention. Others were handed clean clothes, blankets, and shoes that fit. Every act, no matter how small, carried the weight of shock. The women began to realize the Americans were not just refraining from cruelty, they were providing care. Intentional care, care without expectation. Marta noticed how her hands shook as she held the clean fabric for the first time. She touched it again and again, almost afraid that the softness might vanish. Nearby, Lise tugged at the seams of a new skirt, marveling silently. One by one, the auxiliaries began moving beyond the paralysis of disbelief, tentatively following the soldiers' instructions. Then came the moment no one had anticipated. Outside the tents, a small group of American soldiers began clearing debris from a nearby path, smoothing the mud with shovels and wooden planks. They were ordinary men doing ordinary work, but the German women watched, utterly captivated. This simple act of maintenance, of making the camp more livable, spoke louder than any words of promise or surrender. Marta hesitated. She wanted to help, but feared that any gesture might be misinterpreted. Then Ortega approached and offered a hand. Smiling gently, she took it. Together, they lifted a fallen plank and set it in place. The physical labor was simple, yet in that moment, Marta felt the first stirrings of trust. A human connection that was not predicated on fear, propaganda, or authority, only collaboration. Lise, emboldened by Marta's action, stepped forward and joined another group moving barrels of water. The fear that had once paralyzed her slowly unraveled. For the first time, she laughed, a short, incredulous sound, barely audible, but unmistakably genuine. The sound startled everyone nearby, including the American soldiers, who paused and smiled. Marta's mind reeled. Laughter, trust, cooperation. These were things she had been trained to suppress, to deny, to see as vulnerabilities. And yet here they were, unearned yet freely given. By midday, the camp was alive with quiet, purposeful movement. American soldiers and German prisoners worked side by side, not as captors and captives, but as human beings navigating the aftermath of a collapse neither had wanted, yet both had survived. The barriers of fear and suspicion began to erode with each shared task, each small kindness, each gesture of inclusion. Marta Klein paused for a moment, looking across the camp. She noticed tears on more than one cheek, tears not of despair, but of disbelief and dawning hope. The war, she realized, had taught her to expect cruelty. Yet here, in this American camp, she had found its opposite: patience, care, and respect. She could feel the mental walls she had built over years of propaganda slowly dissolving. And then came the whisper among the prisoners, a question no one had dared to voice. "Are they really not going to hurt us?" The words hung in the air like smoke from a dying fire, uncertain and fragile. The answer would not come from soldiers or officers. It would come from experience, and the women were about to receive a lesson none of them would forget. Because as the sun climbed higher and warmth spread through the tents, someone, an American nurse, opened a small door leading into the camp infirmary. Inside were the tools of care: bandages, medicines, a clean cot for each patient, and for the first time, the women were invited to sit on those cots themselves, to lie down without restraint, to be tended to without fear. Marta stepped in. She lay on the cot, feeling the fabric beneath her back, feeling a blanket drape gently over her shoulders. She closed her eyes and let herself breathe. Not in panic, not in anticipation of pain, just breathe. It was an unfamiliar freedom, and the emotional shock was almost unbearable. Her tears came quietly, uncontrollably, not from hunger, not from exhaustion, but from the realization that anyone could act with pure humanity, even in the midst of war. And in that cot, lying under a clean blanket, with a medic gently tending to her scrapes and bruises, Marta Klein understood something she had never imagined: the enemy could be kind. And if the enemy could be kind, then perhaps the world might be rebuilt, brick by brick, with something stronger than fear. But even as hope settled, there remained a shadow over the camp, a whisper of doubt in the back of every mind. Could this kindness survive the world outside the wire? Or was it only temporary, a fragile illusion before reality's harsh return? By late afternoon, the camp hummed with quiet activity. The women had been fed, bathed, and bandaged. Clean clothes replaced tattered uniforms. Even the youngest auxiliary girls, who had barely seen a battlefield, moved, with cautious curiosity, peering over fences, following soldiers as they worked. Marta Klein walked slowly along the wooden walkway, hands clasped behind her back. She watched Lise kneel by a barrel, washing her face with warm water. The ripple of her reflection distorted across the surface, her pale cheeks streaked with tears that had dried and returned in waves. It should have felt safe. It should have felt ordinary. But Marta's chest remained tight. Every act of kindness from the Americans gnawed at her assumptions. Each moment of calm, each shared smile, was a paradox that refused resolution. She had been trained to expect cruelty, to recognize the enemy by harshness, by domination, by the fear they inflicted. And yet, here, none of it existed. She stopped in front of a tent where a group of women were quietly sewing. Supplies had been issued to mend their uniforms, even their civilian garments. A red-haired corporal from the camp approached, carrying a tray of chocolate ration bars, more of the same that had brought sobs the previous night. He offered a bar to Marta. Her hand froze halfway. She looked at him. War had taught her that gifts came with strings. She searched his face for malice, found none. He smiled lightly. For you. Marta's throat tightened. She wanted to say no. She wanted to refuse to be indebted, to keep control. But her fingers, shaking, took the bar anyway. And then it happened. A small laugh slipped past her lips. A laugh she didn't recognize as hers. Then, tears. Hot, unrelenting tears rolled down her face, as though months of fear, exhaustion, and terror had finally found a single release. She dropped to her knees, the chocolate crumpled in her hand, and sobbed. Other women watched, some covering their mouths, some weeping quietly beside her. This was not humiliation, not surrender. This was shock. Raw, unfiltered disbelief that the so-called enemy, could act with pure kindness without a hidden agenda. Lieutenant Helen Morris appeared silently beside Marta, placing a gentle hand on her shoulder. She did not speak. She did not scold. She simply let the woman cry. Time seemed to stretch. Moments ticked past. The camp became a cathedral of whispered grief and fragile relief. Then, from outside the tents, a voice called sharply, "All auxiliaries, line up." Marta rose unsteadily, wiping her face. She glanced at Lise, who hesitated before following her. Their small cluster of women formed a reluctant line behind the other prisoners. Outside, Captain Ellison awaited with his clipboard, calm, professional, yet there was a hint of something in his eyes, respect, perhaps, for the small humanity emerging in this chaos. He gave instructions. They would be transported to a larger processing facility. The American guards were courteous, guiding them without force. For many of the women, the thought of leaving the camp was terrifying. Here, they had been cared for. Here, they had known kindness. Beyond the wire, they feared uncertainty, suspicion, and the harsh reality of a world still at war in pockets across Europe. Marta's gaze lingered on the tense cots, the warmth, the organized efficiency. She realized, with an almost unbearable clarity, that for the first time in months, she did not fear what would happen immediately. Her dread now belonged to tomorrow, to the unknown, and yet there was a strange courage growing inside her, born not from guns or orders, but from the unexpected humanity she had witnessed. She felt it in her chest, strong enough to overpower the instinct to flee, to resist, to doubt. As they boarded the trucks for transport, Marta glanced once more at Lieutenant Morris. Their eyes met, and in that silent exchange, everything shifted. The line between enemy and human blurred. Years of propaganda and fear, hatred and suspicion, dissolved into one impossible truth: the Americans had treated them as people. And people real, living, flawed humans could act with unexpected mercy, even in war. The convoy rumbled to life. Dust rose around the tires. Marta sat back, chocolate clutched in her lap, staring at the fading tents. Lise leaned against her shoulder, sobs long spent, replaced by a tentative curiosity. Somewhere behind them, the camp continued its quiet rhythm. Soldiers moved, supplies were organized, food prepared. No one celebrated, no one gloated. And that, perhaps, was the most shocking of all. The war had not yet ended completely. There were orders to follow, territories to secure, responsibilities that would not vanish with a surrender. But here, in this moment, Marta realized something she had not dared to imagine: the war could end in a human way. The question now was simple and terrifying. Could she carry this understanding beyond the fence? Could she unlearn the hatred that had been drilled into her for years? Or would the world force her back into fear and suspicion, leaving the memory of kindness to fade like a dream she had never truly lived? As the trucks rolled westward, the answers remained uncertain. But one thing was undeniable: the seed of something impossible had been planted in the hearts of German women prisoners, and nothing, not propaganda, not fear, not even years of war, could erase it. The convoy moved steadily along the river road, engines humming, tires crunching over gravel. Dust and sunlight played across the backs of the German women, highlighting mud-streaked faces now softened by exhaustion and, surprisingly, relief. The air smelled faintly of spring damp earth, budding grass, the distant promise of life beyond destruction. Inside the truck, silence reigned, not the tense, expectant silence of fear, but the fragile, reverent quiet of minds processing something entirely new. Marta Klein sat with Lise beside her, hands folded in her lap, chocolate wrapper still clenched like talisman. Outside, the landscape of ruins unfolded. Burned-out towns, flattened farms, abandoned vehicles, all reminders of a world that had been violently unmade. And yet, within the walls of this American camp, and now this moving convoy, the women felt something that had eluded them for years: safety. Lieutenant Morris walked alongside the trucks, speaking softly to anyone who looked her way, offering a word, a smile, a small reassurance that the journey ahead was not punishment, but procedure. Marta noticed how she carried herself: calm, firm, yet gentle, and realized that leadership could exist without intimidation. By late afternoon, the convoy arrived at the temporary processing center, a former school converted for prisoner care. Here, the American soldiers had prepared something remarkable: clean beds, organized mess halls, a small infirmary, and even a modest library of books and newspapers for the prisoners. Nothing flashy, nothing ostentatious, just enough to remind human beings, enemy or not, that they still existed in a world worth tending to. Marta stepped down carefully, taking in the scene. The women followed slowly, hesitant but curious. The camp staff greeted them not with commands, but with directions and patience. Even the MP guards offered polite words, guiding them without force. At that moment, Marta understood something profound: kindness could exist in war. It could be deliberate, it could shape minds, it could fracture assumptions built over decades of fear and hatred. Hours passed, women bathed, meals were served. Sleep came in short bursts, Yet even the rest was different this time. No fear of sudden raids. No nightmares of relentless interrogation. They were allowed to be human again. Late that evening, Marta and Lise sat outside a tent, wrapped in blankets, watching the sunset streak the sky with bruised purples and soft golds. Silence stretched comfortably between them. "You believe them?" Lise asked quietly. Her voice trembled. "That they won't hurt us?" Marta looked across the camp, at soldiers moving calmly, tending to other prisoners, talking to one another as if the world had not been burning only days ago. She inhaled deeply. "I don't know," she admitted, her voice soft, "but I know they have already shown us something no one expected. Something impossible." Lise nodded, unsure of words, but understanding anyway. A short distance away, Sergeant Harper helped a group of women organize their personal belongings. His quiet diligence and attention to their comfort made a deep impression on Marta. She realized then that the enemy was not just one person, one uniform, or one ideology. It could be a choice. A deliberate choice to act human in the face of destruction. As darkness fell, the women lay in their cots, listening to the faint sounds of camp life, quiet laughter, the clink of utensils, the low murmur of conversation in English, German, and broken attempts at both. The night was still, heavy, with the shadow of war, but for the first time, hope felt real enough to touch. Marta closed her eyes, chocolate long finished, but the taste lingering not on her tongue, but in memory. A memory she knew she would carry forever. A memory that would challenge everything she had been taught about enemies, kindness, and humanity. Somewhere deep inside, a question settled like a seed. If kindness could survive here, in the midst of war, could it survive anywhere? And she knew the answer might determine not just their survival, but the shape of the world they would face after the war. Because moments like this, unexpected, human, tender, were rare. But they were powerful. They could break hate. They could rewrite belief. And they would linger in memory far longer than fear ever could. Marta Klein drifted into sleep that night, with that thought pressing gently against her chest. For the first time since capture, she felt something that felt dangerously like freedom.